in the long dark summer of 1942. While most of Europe trembled beneath the shadow of the Second World War, the occupied city of Kiev, once proud, cultured, and bursting with football passionately broken under German command, its stadiums turned to rubble and its players scattered like dust in the wind. Yet within that ruin flickered a small, defiant flame that would one day burn its way into legend, the story of FC Start, the team that played not for medals or cheers but for dignity itself. Before the war, Kiev had been a football-mad city. Crowds once filled the stands of the Dynamo Stadium to watch Dynamo Kyiv, one of the Soviet Union's most talented clubs, whose players combined quick passing and discipline with a sense of artistry that made them a symbol of Soviet sporting pride. Then came 1941, the German invasion, air raids, hunger, arrests. Many Dynamo players were captured or forced into hiding. Some joined the army, others simply vanished. Among the survivors was Mikola Trusovic, Dynamo's goalkeeper, who found himself taken prisoner and later released into a city stripped of freedom. He, along with a few other ex-players, Ivan Kuzmenko, Alexei Klemenko, Mikhail Sviridovsky, Makar Goncharenko and others, found work in a local bread factory called No One Bakery, a small mercy arranged by a sympathetic manager who happened to be a football fan. Despite exhaustion, rationing, and constant danger, these men could not abandon the game that had defined their lives. In secret corners and bomb-scarred courtyards they kicked improvised balls made of rags and leather scraps, keeping alive not only their skills but also a sense of identity. Word of their talent spread quickly. Even the occupying authorities, keen to maintain order and morale, began organizing friendly matches between military teams and local sides. Out of this strange mix of propaganda and entertainment emerged FC Start, the bakery team that was really Dynamo Kyiv reborn under another name. Their first matches, played in the spring and summer of 1942, shocked everyone. The Ukrainians beat Hungarian, Romanian, and German garrison teams with ease, winning 7-2, 6-0, 11-0 scores that humiliated the occupiers and electrified the local population. Each victory drew larger crowds to the small Zenit Stadium, and though the matches were supposed to be light amusements, they became acts of psychological rebellion. Rumors reached the German high command. These bread factory workers were not merely playing, they were defying. To reassert authority, officials arranged a special game against Luftwaffe, an elite Luftwaffe team composed of trained military athletes, many with semi-professional backgrounds. It was to be both a contest and a demonstration of superiority. Flyers were printed, invitations sent to officers, and even Gestapo agents took seats near the field to observe. On August 9, 1942, under the hot Kiev sun, the crowd swelled beyond the fences. Men and women packed shoulder to shoulder, their faces drawn but expectant. Soldiers patrolled the edges with rifles. The players of FC Start arrived in patched-up red shirts, remnants of old Dynamo gear, while Flakhelf appeared in crisp white uniforms, symbols of the regime's order and might. The whistle blew, and for 90 minutes, history condensed into a struggle that transcended sport. Flakhelf struck first. Scoring after rough tackles went unpunished by the German referee. But the Ukrainians answered quickly, combining swift passes and fearless runs. Trusovic saved shot after shot. Goncharenko weaved through defenders as if weaving through the war itself. And by halftime the score stood 3-1 in favor of the locals. At the interval, according to later testimony, a German officer approached the Ukrainian locker area and quietly reminded them to remember who you are playing. It was an unmistakable warning: lose or face consequences. The players looked at one another, hungry, bruised, half-starved, and nodded not in fear but in unity. They returned to the field and played harder. The crowd, sensing the moment, began to roar with every Ukrainian pass. Flakhelf grew desperate, using elbows and kicks. But FC Start kept scoring 4-1, then 5-3 by the final whistle. Against all odds, they had beaten the Luftwaffe. Spectators erupted. It was more than a victory. It was a spark of national pride under occupation. Yet triumph carried a deadly price. In the following days, German papers downplayed the loss, calling it a well-fought exhibition, but secret police files marked the players' names. Within weeks, many FC Start members were arrested under various pretexts, accused of being Soviet agents or spreading anti-German sentiment. Some were beaten, interrogated, and sent to the Seretz labor camp near Babi Yar, the ravine, already infamous for mass executions. Conditions there were inhuman. Prisoners forced to haul stones, sleep on bare ground, and live on crusts of bread. Still, even in captivity, the footballers retained dignity. Witnesses recalled Trusovic keeping goal in imaginary games during roll call, using a rag ball to remind others of freedom. In early 1943, several of them, Trusovic among them, were executed after a camp incident. Others survived the war, carrying the memory of their teammates like a wound that never healed. After liberation, Soviet authorities turned the match into legend, naming it the Death Match, portraying the players as martyrs who knowingly sacrificed themselves by defeating the Germans. Over time, the line between fact and myth blurred. Historians later discovered that some details were exaggerated, that not all players were executed for that exact reason. Yet none could deny the symbolism, the courage of men who risked everything to play honestly in a dishonest world. Statues were raised in Kiev. A film called Third Half dramatized their story, and each retelling added new shades of meaning. For the people who lived through occupation, the memory of that game was less about political narrative and more about human spirit. The idea that a simple football match could assert life's value in the face of tyranny. Even decades later, survivors described hearing the echo of the crowd as something holy, a chorus that said, "We are still here." Thus, the match of August 9, 1942 stands as one of the rarest and most haunting events in football history, a moment when sport fused with resistance, when a team of bakers in worn-out boots confronted an empire and, if only for 90 minutes, won. The tale survives not merely as a record of scores and names, but as testimony to the unbreakable connection between the game and the human soul, a reminder that, even under occupation, amid hunger and fear, people will find a field, draw 2 goals in the dirt, and play for freedom itself. But the story did not end with the final whistle or the arrests. It stretched forward through the fog of war and into the post-war years, where the surviving threads of truth were rewoven into a tapestry that served both memory and ideology. For as the Red Army pushed westward in 1943 and 1944, liberating Ukraine city by city, the first whispers of the deathmatch began to circulate among soldiers and civilians alike, carried on the lips of those who had stood in the Zenit Stadium and seen the impossible happen. And when Kiev was finally freed on November 6, 1943, the returning Dynamo players who had fought in the partisans or the regular army sought out their old comrades, only to learn the grim fate of Trusevich, Kuzmenko, Klemenko, and the others. And in the shattered streets, amid the rubble and the rebuilding, the matches of 1942 took on a near myth, spoken of in hushed tones as proof that the human spirit could not be fully crushed. The Soviet state, ever eager to harness symbols of resistance for its own narrative, quickly recognized the propaganda value of the story. By 1944, journalists from Pravda and local papers were dispatched to interview survivors, and the first official accounts began to appear, framing FC Start not just as a football team but as a microcosm of Soviet defiance against fascism, with the players cast as selfless heroes who chose death over dishonor. Even though the reality was more complex, some had been arrested for reasons unrelated to the match, others executed in reprisals for camp escapes, and a few, like Makarg, managed to evade capture and live in hiding until liberation. Yet the myth served a purpose. It gave the war-weary population a story of moral victory, a counterpoint to the millions of graves. And so the name The Deathmatch was born, coined by a sportswriter who likened the August 9th game to a duel where the stakes were life itself. In the late 1940s, as Stalin tightened his grip and Ukraine was reintegrated into the USSR, the story was further polished. Schoolchildren learned of the bakers who beat the Luftwaffe, and Dynamo Kyiv, re-established as a premier club, honored the dead by retiring certain numbers and holding minute silences before big games, while in Sirets, the former campsite, a modest plaque was placed near the ravine, though Babi Yar itself would wait decades for proper memorialization due to official silence on the Holocaust. The first major public commemoration came in 1959 with the release of the Soviet Yugoslav film Third Half, directed by Yevgeny Karelov, which dramatized the events with cinematic flair, slow-motion goals, ominous close-ups of SS officers, and a climactic scene where the players salute the crowd before being led away. Knowing their fate yet, the film took liberties, inventing a pre-match ultimatum delivered by a sneering German general and compressing the timeline so that arrests followed immediately after the final whistle, liberties that irritated some survivors but captivated audiences across the Eastern Bloc, turning the deathmatch into a staple of Cold War cultural memory. Meanwhile, in the archives of the NKVD and later the KGB, declassified files painted a murkier picture. Interrogation transcripts revealed that several players had indeed been NKVD informants before the war, a common practice in Soviet sports, and that their arrests in 1942 stemmed partly from pre-war dossiers rather than the match alone. Yet such nuances were buried beneath a heroic narrative, for to question the purity of the martyrs was to question the righteousness of the great patriotic war. Survivor testimonies, collected in the 1960s and 1970s by Ukrainian sports historians like Oleksandr Yap, offered the most humanizing details. Goncharenko, who lived until 1997, recounted in interviews how the team never discussed politics on the pitch, how their only goal was to play beautiful football and remind themselves they were still alive, how Trusevich once saved a penalty by diving so hard he tore his only pair of shorts, and how the crowd's roar on August 9th felt like the voice of Kiev itself rising from the ashes. Another survivor, Volodymyr Balakin, spoke of smuggling bread crusts to teammates in Sirets, hiding them in his sleeves during work details. Small acts of solidarity that kept hope flickering. These oral histories, preserved in the Dynamo Kyiv Museum and later digitized, revealed the players as ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances, brothers, husbands who found in football a language stronger than fear. By the 1980s, as glasnost loosened censorship, Western researchers gained access to Soviet archives and began cross-referencing German records, discovering that the Fleischkampf team was not the invincible squadron of myth, but a collection of enthusiastic amateurs reinforced by a few ringers, and that the referee, while biased, had not been an SS officer but a low-ranking Wehrmacht soldier. Such findings sparked debates in academic journals, with some accusing the Soviets of inflating the story to demonize the enemy. Yet even revisionists acknowledged the core truth. The matches happened, the victories were real, and the reprisals were brutal. In independent Ukraine after 1991, the death match was reclaimed as national heritage rather than Soviet propaganda. The Zenit Stadium, long since demolished, was commemorated with a plaque at its former site. And in 2002, on the 60th anniversary, President Leonid Kuchma attended a ceremony where aging survivors and descendants of the executed laid flowers at the Dynamo Stadium, now renamed in honor of Valery Lobanovsky, yet still echoing with the ghosts of 1942. A new monument was unveiled in 2012. Near the bakery's seat, a bronze sculpture of 11 players in their faces etched with determination, the ball frozen at Goncharenko's foot. And every year on August 9th, local school teams play a memorial tournament, kicking off at the exact minute the original match began. Documentaries like the 2012 Ukrainian-German co-production match revisited the story with survivor interviews and reconstructed footage, striving for balance between myth and fact, while FIFA recognized the event in its centennial history of football, listing the death match among the sport's most courageous moments. Yet perhaps the most poignant memorials are the quiet ones. The elderly woman in Kiev who still keeps a faded red scrap of fabric said to be from Trusevich's shirt, the amateur club in Serets that paints FC Start on its jerseys, the annual pilgrimage of Dynamo Ultras to Bobby Yar, where they leave football scarves alongside stones of remembrance. Through all these layers, official myth, survivor truth, scholarly debate, popular memory, the death match endures as more than a wartime anecdote. It is a parable about the power of play in the face of annihilation, a reminder that when empires seek to erase identity, a simple game can become an act of resurrection, and that even in the darkest chapter of the 20th century, 11 men in patched red shirts proved that the human spirit, like a perfectly weighted through ball, can arc over any defense and find the back of the net. To truly understand the weight of that August afternoon, one must step further back into the sunlit pre-war world of Dynamo Kyiv, where the roots of FC Start were nurtured in a culture of discipline, camaraderie, and relentless ambition. For in the 1930s, the club was not merely a sports team but a state-sponsored institution designed to showcase Soviet physical superiority. Yet within its rigid framework flourished a uniquely Ukrainian expression of the beautiful game, fast, fluid, almost balletic in its precision, and at the heart of this golden era stood men who would later don the red of FC Start under far grimmer skies. Mykola Trusevich, born in 1908 in a village near Vinnytsia, had risen through the ranks as a goalkeeper of extraordinary reflexes, known for his calm demeanor and ability to read strikers like open books. Teammates recalled how he trained with weighted balls and practiced diving onto hard-packed dirt until his elbows bled, all while studying German philosophy in secret, dreaming of a world beyond the goalposts. Ivan Kuzmenko, the powerful centre-forward, came from a family of blacksmiths in Poltava, his thighs like forged iron. His headers, legendary opposing defenders swore the ball changed direction mid-flight when it left his forehead, and off the pitch, he was a poet, scribbling verses about the Dnieper River on cigarette papers during away trips. Makar Goncharenko, the wiry winger from Kharkiv, possessed a left foot that could bend reality. Coaches timed his sprints and marveled at his ability to accelerate from standstill to full speed in 3 strides, a gift honed by racing trams as a boy through bomb-cratered streets during the Civil War. These were not just athletes, they were products of a system that demanded excellence while quietly allowing regional pride to simmer beneath the surface. And under coach Mikhail Tovarovsky, Dynamo developed a style that married Soviet collectivism with Slavic triangular passes, sudden switches of play, and a pressing game that suffocated opponents long before the term gegenpressing entered the lexicon. The Dynamo Stadium, opened in 1934 with a capacity of 23,000, became a cauldron of noise on match days. Factory workers, students, and party officials mingled in the stands, chanting in Ukrainian despite official discouragement. And when Dynamo won the Soviet championship in 1936, the city erupted in celebrations that lasted 3 days, with players carried on shoulders through Khrushchev while accordions played and kvass flowed like champagne. Yet beneath the glory lay tension. The Great Purge of 1937-38 claimed several Dynamo administrators, and players lived in fear of denunciation. One wrong joke in the locker room could mean Siberia, so they bonded through silence and shared risk, trusting only the language of the ball. When war came, this culture did not vanish. It went underground, resurfacing in the bakery courtyard where Trusevich organized five-a-side games using a ball stuffed with sawdust, shouting instructions in the same clipped tone he once used against Spartak Moscow. And it was this continuity of spirit that transformed a workplace team into a symbol. Across occupied Europe, the Germans employed sport as both carrot and stick ***. Reichssport für ***. Hans von Chammer under Essen decreed that football should continue in subjugated territories to demonstrate the normality of life under the new order, and in cities from Warsaw to Athens. Local clubs were forced to compete against Wehrmacht 11s. The outcomes carefully managed to avoid embarrassing the master race. Yet in Ukraine the strategy backfired spectacularly. The occupation authorities established the Rock Sports Society to oversee Ukrainian teams, requiring them to register and play under strict guidelines: no political symbols, no pre-1939 club names, mandatory salutes to the swastika. Matches would build as friendship games meant to foster collaboration, with German military bands playing before kickoff and propaganda films shot for newsreels back in Berlin. In Kiev, the Zenit Stadium, a modest 5,000-seat venue spared from bombing, was repurposed for these spectacles. Its pitch hastily repaired with prisoner labor, and the first official match under occupation pitted a Ukrainian select side against a Romanian garrison unit on June 7, 1942, ending in a scripted 3-3 draw that satisfied no one. Into this controlled environment stepped FC Start, initially just another bakery team. But their opening game on July 11th against a Hungarian signals unit ended 6-0, the goals coming so fast that the Hungarian captain requested the second half be shortened to 30 minutes for fatigue, a request denied with polite smiles by the German organizer. Word spread through the city's black market and whispered conversations in bread lines. The bakers were Dynamo in disguise, and each subsequent victory 7-2 over a Ukrainian police team, 5-1 over a railway workers' side, 11-0 over a Wehrmacht artillery 11 drew larger crowds, many sneaking past checkpoints with forged papers, their cheers growing bolder until they drowned out the military band. The match-by-match chronicle of FC Start's 1942 campaign reads like a crescendo of defiance. On July 17th they faced MSG Wall, a German administrative team, and won 6-0 with Kuzmenko scoring for his powerful runs, leaving defenders grasping air. On July 19th came the rematch against the Hungarians, now reinforced, yet still crushed 5-1. Goncharenko's solo run from his own half ending with a chipped finish over a despairing goalkeeper. By August 6th, when they dismantled Pete, a Ukrainian collaborationist side, 8-0, the German authorities grew nervous, issuing orders that future opponents must field their strongest lineups and that referees always German were to maintain balance. The August 9th clash with Flakelf was thus the culmination of a summer-long escalation. A game announced with fanfare in the occupation newspaper Novoye Ukrainskoye Slovo, promising a display of Aryan athletic prowess. Yet from the opening kickoff it unraveled for the Luftwaffe. Klimenko intercepted a lazy back pass in the 3rd minute and slotted home, the crowd erupting in a roar that rattled the corrugated roof. And though Flakelf equalized through a dubious penalty, FC Start responded with a Goncharenko free kick that curled into the top corner like a guided missile. The half-time lead of 3-1 achieved despite a fractured rib suffered by Sviridovsky after a brutal aerial challenge. The second half saw the warning delivered in the tunnel survivor accounts. A GRE and SS officer named Paul Fischer entered the Ukrainian changing room, clicked his heels, and said in broken Russian, "Play well, but remember the consequences." Of victory, a threat met with stony silence, and yet the team returned to the field transformed. Their passes crisper, their tackles fiercer, Kuzmenko heading in the 4th from a Trusevic long throw, the goalkeeper having launched the ball 70 yards with a single punt, and when Flakelf pulled one back to 4-2, it was Pavla Komarov, the quiet left-back, who restored the margin with a 30-yard screamer that left the German keeper rooted. The final 5-3 scoreline, sealed by a late Goncharenko tap-in, triggered pandemonium. Spectators stormed the pitch, lifting players aloft while German officers slipped away through side exits, and in that moment the Zenit Stadium became a pocket of liberated territory. 90 minutes where the Reich's mythology of invincibility lay in tatters at the feet of half-starved Ukrainians. The aftermath unfolded with chilling efficiency. On August 18th, Gestapo agents raided the bakery during the night shift, dragging Trusevic and Kuzmenko from the ovens, still dusted with flour, their arrests justified by forged documents linking them to pre-war NKVD activities. And though the players were initially held in separate cells at Lukyanivska prison, they managed to pass messages via sympathetic guards, promising to keep the team together even in captivity. The Seretz camp, established in July 1942 on the edge of Babi Yar, was a place of calculated cruelty. Prisoners ordered to level the ravine's killing grounds, erasing evidence of the September 1941 massacre of 33,771 Jews. Yet, within its barbed wire the footballers formed a quiet resistance, organizing secret matches using a ball fashioned from socks and rags, Trusevic standing between two upturned buckets as goal, his saves drawing weak smiles from men who had forgotten joy. On February 24, 1943, Following a failed escape attempt by other prisoners, the camp commandant ordered a reprisal execution. Trusevich, Kuzmenko, Klemenko, and Alexei Klemenko were among those lined up at dawn, shot against the ravine wall. Their bodies tumbled into the same earth they had once played upon in freedom, while Goncharenko, hidden in a Kiev attic by a former teammate's widow, listened to distant gunfire and wept for the first time since the occupation began. The war's end brought no immediate clarity. The surviving players, Goncharenko, Mykola Korotkik, who died in 1944 under unclear circumstances, and others returned to a Dynamo Kyiv rebuilt under coach Alahush. But the club's 1944 championship was dedicated to the dead. Each goal met with applause that carried the weight of mourning, and in the decades that followed, the deathmatch evolved from whispered memory to national scripture, its truth and myth intertwined like the laces on a worn leather ball, forever kicking against the darkness. To grasp the full human texture of FC Start, one must linger on the lives of the men behind the legend, each biography a thread in the red fabric that fluttered over Zenit Stadium in 1942. Beginning with Mykola Trusevich, the stoic goalkeeper whose pre-war life was a study in quiet determination, orphaned at 12. During the 1921 famine, he survived by herding geese along the southern Bug River, with developing the lung capacity that later allowed him to shout instructions across entire pitches. Joining Dynamo in 1932, he became the first Ukrainian to captain the Soviet national team in an unofficial friendly against Turkey, a match he remembered not for the 4-1 victory but for the way the Istanbul crowd sang in harmony, a sound he tried to recreate in training by humming folk tunes while catching crosses. Ivan Kuzmenko, the battering-ram striker, grew up hammering iron beside his father, learning that power came not from brute force but from timing. Each swing of the hammer had to land at the precise moment the metal glowed orange, and he applied the same principle to heading balls, timing his leaps to meet crosses at their apex, a technique that produced 23 goals in the 1938 Soviet season alone. Off the field he courted his future wife Hannah by reciting Pushkin beneath her balcony, only to be interrupted by air raid drills that sent them both scrambling for cover, a courtship conducted in bomb shelters and bread queues. Makar, the fleet-footed winger, was the team's joker, known for juggling oranges in the dressing room and impersonating Stalin's Georgian accent to lighten tense moments before big games. Yet his humor masked a fierce patriotism. He had volunteered for the Red Army in 1941, only to be captured near Uman and escape by swimming the Siniuka River at night, an ordeal that left him with a permanent limp he hid from German doctors during occupation medical checks. Alexei Klemenko, the elegant playmaker, studied mathematics at Kiev University before the war, sketching passing triangles on napkins during lectures and once solving a geometry problem using the trajectory of a curling frick. His wife recalled how he taught their daughter to count using goal tallies, turning match reports into bedtime stories. Mikhail Sviridovsky, the tenacious fullback, came from a family of Cossack descent and carried a small icon of St. Nicholas in his boot, kissing it before every match, a ritual that continued where he pressed the icon into the dirt to mark his goal line during clandestine games. Pavlo Komarov, the left-back with the thunderous shot, had been a violinist in his youth, his left foot trained to precision by years of bowing strings, and teammates swore his long-range goals followed the same arc as a perfectly executed glass. Fedor Tukev, the versatile midfielder, was a former boxer who brought ring craft to the pitch, feinting with hips, slipping tackles like jabs, while Volodymyr, the youngest at 22 in 1942, idolized Trusevich and mimicked his every move, from the way he rolled his sleeves to the way he narrowed his eyes before a penalty save. These men were not ideologues, they were workers, dreamers, family men bound by a shared language of movement and trust. And when they gathered in the No. 1 bakery courtyard in April 1942, kneading dough by day and plotting lineups by night, they did so not to overthrow the Reich but to reclaim the 1 hour a week when they were not prisoners, bakers, or ghosts. The German sports propaganda machine, meanwhile, operated with bureaucratic precision across the occupied East. The Ost issued directives in March 1942 ordering local administrators to promote physical culture among the native population to prevent idleness and unrest, and in Ukraine this translated into a network of sports community supervised by SD cultural officers who vetted team names, banned red and black kits associated with Ukrainian nationalists, and required pre-match oaths of loyalty. In Kiev, Hauptmann Wilhelm Kube, a former Berlin referee turned propaganda liaison, personally approved FC Start's registration, noting in his log that the bakery workers appeared disciplined and apolitical, a miscalculation that would haunt the occupation hierarchy. Matches were filmed by PK6, a propaganda company that edited highlights to show German victories, but when FC Start's winning streak began, the footage was shelved, replaced by staged exhibitions of Aryan youth gymnastics. Still, underground networks duplicated grainy stills of Goncharenko celebrating, passing them hand-to-hand like crowd psychology during these games evolved from cautious curiosity to open defiance. The first spectators in June 1942 were mostly collaborationist officials and off-duty soldiers, clapping politely at scripted draws. But by July the stands filled with ordinary Kievans, women in headscarves, teenagers with forged work passes, even priests in civilian clothes who began smuggling sunflower seeds to throw onto the pitch after Ukrainian goals, a subtle nod to pre-war traditions. The sound of the crowd transformed from muffled applause to rhythmic chanting of start that echoed the banned Ukrainian anthem, and when Kuzmenko scored his fourth against MSG Wall, a woman in the front row unfurled a tiny embroidered rushnika, traditional towel-waving, until a soldier tore it from her hands, an act that only amplified the roar. The August 9th Flakelf match marked the zenith of this communal catharsis. Attendance estimates ranged from 8,000 to 12,000, with people perched on rooftops and clinging to fences. And when Goncharenko scored the third goal just before halftime, the noise registered on a German sound truck parked outside, its needles spiking into the red. Survivors later described a physical sensation, as if the collective exhale of the crowd lifted the ball into the net. The first Soviet investigations began within days of Kiev's liberation on November 6, 1943, when Smersh counterintelligence officers, combing Gestapo files in the ruined Pachursk district, uncovered arrest warrants for Trusevich Mykola, former Dynamo player, suspected NKVD collaborator, and similar documents for Kuzmenko and Klemenko. Initially, this threatened to taint the emerging hero narrative, but a young lieutenant named Viktor Nekrasovleter, a famous writer, interviewed bakery manager Josip Korduba, who testified that the players had never discussed politics, only football, and that their victories were a gift to the hungry city. By December 1943, a special commission under the Ukrainian SSR's Sports Committee compiled a 47-page report, complete with match programs smuggled out by a Zenit groundsman and eyewitness accounts from 23 spectators, concluding that the bakery team's actions constituted a spontaneous act of patriotic resistance, a phrase that became the cornerstone of all future narratives. The report was classified until 1956, but excerpts appeared in the newspaper Radiansky Sport in January 1944, illustrated with a charcoal sketch of Trusevich diving to his left, an image that would be reproduced on posters across the Republic. These early inquiries also recovered fragments of Flakelf's own logbook, seized from a burned-out Luftwaffe barracks, revealing that the German team had been ordered to win at all costs and that their coach Georg Morgenstern faced a disciplinary hearing for failure to uphold military honor, a revelation buried in Soviet files to preserve the David and Goliath framing. Thus, even as the war raged on, the death match was already being sculpted into legend, its rough edges smoothed by the state's chisel. Yet beneath the varnish, the raw grain of human courage remained visible to anyone who cared to look closely. The Seretz concentration camp, perched on the northwestern edge of Babi Yar, was not merely a prison but a machine designed to erase both body and soul. Established in July 1942 under SS Sturmbannführer Paul Radomski, it held up to 3,000 inmates at its peak, most of them Soviet-posed Jews and suspected partisans, forced to work 12-hour shifts flattening the ravine where tens of thousands had been murdered the previous autumn, shoveling human ash and bone into the Dnieper under threat of instant execution. The footballers arrived in staggered groups after the August 18th raids. Trusevich and Kuzmenko first, then Klemenko and Sviridovsky a week later, each assigned to Commando 1, the unit tasked with destroying evidence of Nazi crimes, and though they were initially separated by barracks, they re-established contact through the camp's underground network, tapping messages on water pipes and passing scraps of paper hidden in bread crusts. Daily life was a cycle of degradation. Roll call at 4:30 a.m. in threadbare uniforms, a breakfast of 150 grams of ersatz bread and chicory water, then marched to the ravine where guards with dogs prodded them to fill carts with soil, the air thick with the stench of decay and lime. Beatings were routine. One prisoner recalled Trusevich being whipped for pausing to wipe sweat from his eyes, and yet the players maintained a code. They shared rations, taught younger inmates to tie their boots properly to avoid frostbite, and in the evenings, when exhaustion allowed, they spoke in whispers of football, reconstructing entire matches from memory. Trusevich diagramming formations with a stick in the dirt, while Kuzmenko mimed headers that sent imaginary balls soaring over invisible crossbars. The clandestine games began in October 1942, organized by Ryhori Tokar, a former referee imprisoned for sabotage, who fashioned a ball from rags bound with strings stolen from the tailor's workshop, played in a narrow alley between barracks during the half-hour lunch break. These 5-minute matches drew small crowds of prisoners who formed a human shield to block the view of guards, and Trusevich, despite a limp from a bayonet wound, volunteered as goalkeeper, his dives into the mud earning cheers that had to be stifled with hands over mouths. The February 24, 1943 executions were triggered not by football but by a broader act of desperation. On the night of February 23, a group of 27 prisoners from Barrack 7 attempted a mass escape, cutting through the inner fence with smuggled wire cutters, only to be betrayed by a collaborator. At dawn, Radomski ordered a reprisal of 1 in 10. and the footballers marked men due to their prominence were among the 300 selected, though only 4 were shot that day: Kuzmenko, Klemenko, and Mikola, the latter a substitute player arrested in September for distributing anti-German leaflets. Witnesses hidden in the latrines later described the scene: prisoners forced to dig their own shallow trench, Trusevich stepping forward to tie Kuzmenko's bootlace when it came undone, the two men embracing briefly before the volley rang out, their bodies collapsing into the pit, still locked in that final gesture of brotherhood. The surviving players in Siritsverodovsky and Baikov were spared only because their work detail was deemed essential, and in the weeks that followed they honored the dead by etching tiny goalposts into the wooden beams of their bunks, a silent vow to keep playing in spirit. Meanwhile, those who evaded arrest, Maka Goncharenko, chief among them, entered a shadow world of hiding sustained by an intricate web of civilian support. Gonch, worn by a bakery colleague on the morning of August 18th, fled with only the clothes on his back and a Dynamo scarf tucked inside his shirt, finding refuge first in the apartment of Alina, widow of teammate Konstantin Shigatsky, who had died in 1941, then moving every few weeks to avoid detection, sleeping in cellars, barns, and once in the hollowed-out belly of a church organ in Padil. Food came from a chain of sympathizers: a tram conductor who left bread in a designated trash bin, a nurse who slipped potatoes into his coat during medical checks, a teenage courier named Lyuda who bicycled messages between safe houses using a code based on football scores. This network, later documented in post-war testimonies, extended to at least 40 individuals, many of whom risked execution for harboring enemies of the Reich. And it was through these fragile links that Goncharenko learned of the Sirits executions in March 1943, a blow that nearly broke him until Alina reminded him that the game isn't over until the final whistle. The myth of the death match crystallized between 1944 and 1959 in a series of carefully orchestrated steps. The 1944 Smersh report became the foundation, circulated internally to justify medals for survivors and pensions for widows. In 1946, Dynamo Kyiv erected a small obelisk at the club's training ground inscribed with the names of the fallen, the first physical monument. By 1950, the story entered school curricula via a chapter in physical culture and sport in the USSR, illustrated with a stylized drawing of a player in red leaping over a swastika-emblazoned goal. And in 1959, Third Half brought the narrative to the masses. Its premiere in Kiev's October Palace, attended by 2,000 people, including Goncharenko himself, who wept silently as the screen showed actors recreating his free kick against Flake, though he later confided to a friend that the real goal had been struck with his right foot, not left as depicted. The film's success, seen by over 20 million in the USSR alone, cemented the ultimatum myth. The compressed timeline, and the image of the players marching to their deaths immediately after victory, distortions that served the state's need for clear moral lines in the early Cold War. Yet they also ensured the story's survival, embedding it in the collective consciousness like a hymn sung at every Dynamo match. Beneath the propaganda, the human story persisted. Goncharenko returned to professional football in 1945, playing for Dynamo until 1952 and scoring 42 goals in 87 appearances, each one a tribute to the teammates he could not save. Balakon became a coach, training youth teams with the same patience Trusevich once showed him, and in quiet moments, survivors gathered at the Dnieper to scatter sunflower seeds into the current, a ritual that began in 1946 and continues among their descendants today. The final chapter belongs not to statues or films but to the enduring echo of that summer afternoon in 1942, when 11 men in patched red shirts stepped onto a scarred pitch and, for 90 minutes, reminded a broken city that courage is not the absence of fear but the refusal to let fear dictate the score. And though empires rise and fall, though truths are bent and myths are born, the ball keeps rolling, the goalposts stand, and somewhere in the window of a zenith's forgotten ground, you can still hear the crowd chanting "Start, start," a sound that says, no matter how dark the night, the game, and the human spirit that plays it, will find a way to go on.